The Scythian warrior's eyes rolled back in his skull, not from poison, not from death. From the smoke rising from the bronze brazier at the centre of the burial chamber, where flowers from a nameless plant smouldered on hot coals. His tribesmen sat in a circle, watching the smoke curl toward the frozen ceiling of their felt tent, somewhere in the Altai Mountains, somewhere around 500 BCE. Snow pressed against the tent walls, wind screamed across the steppe. Inside, the air grew thick and sweet. They were preparing him for the journey. The dead warrior, wrapped in furs, his weapons beside him, would need this smoke where he was going. They all knew it. Their fathers knew it. Their fathers' fathers knew it. The plant that grew wild in the valleys, the one with the saw-toothed leaves and the sticky flowers, the one that made vision bend and time stretch. This was the bridge between worlds. One of the living warriors threw more flowers onto the coals. The smoke thickened. They breathed. And for a moment, just a moment, they could see what the dead man would see. The spirits moving in the darkness, the path he would walk, the world beyond the world. This was not medicine. Not exactly. This was not intoxication. Not quite. This was something humans had no word for yet. Something that existed before language, before law, before anyone thought to ask. Should we be doing this? They never asked. The plant simply grew, and humans simply used it. For 10,000 years. This isn't about getting high. This is about the most successful propaganda campaign in human history. A single plant that reshaped global politics, destroyed millions of lives, and exposed the darkest capabilities of modern government, all while growing wild on every inhabited continent. Like and subscribe to 12 AM Historian, but only if you genuinely want to go deep into uncomfortable truths. Tell me where you're watching from, what time it is there, and what you think this story will reveal. Because I promise you, whatever you think you know about marijuana, cannabis, weed, pot, grass, reefer, Mary Jane, you don't know this. Phone away. Distractions silenced. Because what you're about to learn will reframe everything. Let's go back, all the way back, to the beginning. Somewhere in the high valleys of Central Asia, where glaciers had carved the earth into impossible shapes, and where tribes lived by fire and bone, a wild plant pushed through the soil. Unremarkable, unnamed, unbothered by human opinion. Cannabis sativa, though it wouldn't be called that for thousands of years. The first humans who encountered it were hunters, nomads, people who understood which plants fed and which killed, because getting that wrong meant death. They learned quickly. The fibrous stalks, strong as sinew, useful for rope. The seeds, nutty, oily, packed with protein. The leaves and flowers, those did something else entirely. At some point lost to history, someone threw the dried flowers into a fire. What rose from those embers changed human consciousness forever. Not dramatically, not like a bolt of lightning or revelation from God. Subtly. A slight shift in perception, colors somehow richer, sounds somehow clearer, time somehow different. The hunters saw shapes in the fire they hadn't seen before. The elders said the spirits had spoken. And the plant became sacred, not because anyone commanded it, not because priests declared it, but because humans, in their desperate search for meaning in a brutal world, found that this plant opened a door. Just a crack. Just enough to glimpse something beyond the daily grind of survival. So they kept it. They cultivated it. They carried it with them as they migrated across continents. By the time humans invented writing, cannabis had already spread across Asia. Ancient Chinese farmers grew it for fiber and food. When someone discovered that the female flowers produced a sticky resin that could ease pain, it entered the pharmacopoeia. Emperor Shen Nung, whether he was real or mythological, the texts bearing his name are real enough, described it around 27 or 37 BCE as a treatment for gout, malaria, absent-mindedness. Absent-mindedness. Imagine that. A Chinese emperor, nearly 5,000 years ago, prescribing marijuana to help people remember. In India, it became bhang, ground into a paste, mixed with milk, drunk during religious festivals. The Vedic texts called it one of the 5 sacred plants. Lord Shiva himself was said to favour it. Hindu priests used it to commune with the divine. Common people used it to endure the summer heat. There was no contradiction. The sacred and the practical coexisted without tension. In the Middle East, it spread through trade routes. Sufi mystics smoked it to achieve spiritual states. Persian doctors prescribed it for pain and inflammation. When Islamic scholars compiled medical knowledge, cannabis appeared again and again, not as a vice, as a medicine. And in Africa, where it may have arrived through ancient trade or grown wild on its own, communities wove it into ritual, medicine, and daily life. There's evidence of cannabis use in Egyptian medical papyri, recommendations for inflammation and glaucoma, written on papyrus that somehow survived millennia. The plant travelled without permission. It needed no king's blessing, no emperor's decree. Humans kept finding it, kept using it, kept passing the knowledge down, from the Himalayas to the Mediterranean, from the Nile to the Yellow River. Not everywhere, not all the time, but persistently, quietly, inevitably. Here's what matters. For thousands of years, this plant was ordinary, not in the sense of common. It was too useful to be dismissed, but ordinary in the sense of not forbidden, not taboo, not criminal. It simply existed in the world alongside humans, serving whatever purpose humans needed. Rope when they needed rope, food when they needed food, medicine when they needed medicine, ritual when they needed connection to something larger than themselves. There were no moral panics, no propaganda campaigns, no government agencies dedicated to its eradication, because power hadn't yet learned how to weaponize it. When the plant reached Europe, it came first as hemp, the fibrous industrial version grown for rope and canvas and paper. By the medieval period, European farmers cultivated it widely. Kings mandated it. England's King Henry VIII required farmers to grow hemp, fining those who refused. His navy needed rope. Rope required hemp. Simple as that. When the age of exploration began, every ship that crossed an ocean carried hemp rope. Every sail was woven from hemp canvas. The word canvas itself comes from cannabis. The two were inseparable. You literally couldn't sail the world without it. And when Europeans colonized the Americas, they brought the plant with them. George Washington grew it at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson grew it at Monticello. Not secretly, not shamefully. They grew it the way they grew tobacco and wheat, as a cash crop, an agricultural staple, an economic necessity. Benjamin Franklin's paper mill used hemp. The first drafts of the Declaration of Independence were written on hemp paper. The Gutenberg Bible was printed on it. The Constitution, debatable, but possibly, at minimum, used hemp in early drafts. This is not controversial. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented, mundane, agricultural history. The plant was so normal, so integrated into daily life, that no one thought twice about it. But here's where the story bends. Because while Europeans and Americans grew hemp and used it industrially, they largely ignored the medicinal and intoxicating properties. That knowledge remained strongest in Asia, Africa, the Middle East. Western medicine barely touched it until the 19th century. Then, in the 1830s and 1840s, something shifted. British doctors stationed in India witnessed local use of cannabis for pain, for seizures, for muscle spasms. They brought samples back to England. They ran experiments. And they discovered what much of the world already knew. This plant had legitimate medical properties. By the mid-1800s, cannabis extracts appeared in Western pharmacies. Tinctures, tonics, pills, prescribed by respectable physicians for respectable ailments. Queen Victoria's personal physician, Sir Russell Reynolds, prescribed cannabis for her menstrual cramps. She used it for decades. In America, cannabis appeared in the United States Pharmacopoeia in 1850. It remained there until 1942. For nearly a century, it was official medicine, available in pharmacies, prescribed by doctors, advertised in newspapers. No one panicked. No one screamed about moral decay or societal collapse. It was just another medicine, sitting on the shelf beside aspirin and cocaine, which, yes, was also legal and widely used. This was the equilibrium. The world, as it had been for thousands of years, now formalized through Western medical channels. Cannabis had crossed from folk medicine into institutional legitimacy. And for a brief moment in human history, it seemed the plant had found its place, ancient and modern. Is sacred and scientific, natural and regulated. That equilibrium lasted about 50 years. Then the doors of hell opened. The first crack appeared not in laboratories or hospitals, but in newspapers. 1905, California. A headline screams, "Mexicans smoking loco weed." The plant hasn't changed. The use hasn't changed. Mexican communities in the American Southwest have used cannabis for generations, longer than white Americans have lived in the region. They call it marijuana. A normal word, a Spanish word. But to English-speaking readers in 1905, that word sounds foreign, dangerous, other. And that difference, that tiny linguistic shift, will kill hundreds of thousands of people, not immediately, not obviously, but inevitably. Between 1910 and 1920, the Mexican Revolution tears the country apart. Over 1 million people die. Millions more flee north, crossing into Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California. Refugees, desperate families, workers seeking survival. They bring their culture with them, their language, their customs, their medicine, including cannabis. This creates a problem for white America, not a medical problem, not a public health problem, a perception problem. See, white Americans had been using cannabis in tinctures and tonics for decades, without issue. Cannabis extract, prescribed by white doctors in brown bottles with English labels, was medicine, respectable, scientific, safe. But marijuana, the same plant, dried and smoked by brown-skinned immigrants, that was something else entirely. That was foreign. That was dangerous. That was a drug. The plant didn't change. The people using it changed. And that made all the difference. In El Paso, Texas, 1914, the city council passes an ordinance banning the sale, barter, or gift of cannabis, or any preparation made from cannabis. Why? The official reason, public safety. The actual reason, the city wanted to control its Mexican population. Cannabis prohibition gave police a tool. Any Mexican caught with it could be arrested, searched, deported. The drug was the excuse. The target was the people. El Paso wasn't unique. Across the Southwest, cities and states began passing similar laws. Not because cannabis had suddenly become dangerous, but because the people associated with it had suddenly become visible. By 1930, 16 states had banned cannabis. Not one of those bans was based on medical evidence. Not one was recommended by doctors. Every single one targeted immigrant or minority communities. This is not interpretation. This is explicit in the legislative records. In Utah, the ban targeted Mexican immigrants. In Montana, it targeted Mexicans and Indians. In Louisiana, it targeted black jazz musicians. The racism wasn't subtext, it was text. But the Southwest wasn't the only place cannabis gained a new, racialized identity. In New Orleans, something equally threatening was happening. Jazz. That wild, syncopated, improvisational music coming out of black communities in the South. Music that made white people uncomfortable. Music that broke rules. Music that suggested freedom, sexuality, abandon. All the things that terrified white Christian America. And the musicians who played jazz? Many of them smoked cannabis. Louis Armstrong smoked it. Cab Calloway sang about it. Mez Mesro sold it. In black communities, cannabis was called reefer, tea, muggles. It was part of the culture. Not universal, but present. Woven into the social fabric of the music scene, white newspapers noticed, and they panicked. Suddenly, cannabis wasn't just a Mexican drug. It was also a Negro drug. And if there was anything white America feared, more than Mexican immigrants, it was black Americans asserting autonomy, creating culture, refusing to stay in their assigned social position. Jazz was already seen as corrupting white youth. The fact that some jazz musicians smoked cannabis gave authorities the perfect weapon. They could criminalize the culture by criminalizing the plant. By the late 1920s, the narrative was set. Marijuana, Mexicans, crime reefer, Negroes, jazz, moral decay. The plant that had been medicine when white people used it was now a menace because brown and black people did. The newspapers loved it. Sensationalism sold papers, and nothing was more sensational than stories of drug-crazed minorities threatening white society. Murder weed found up and down coast. Los Angeles Examiner, 1925. Marijuana makes fiends of boys in 30 days. Denver Post, 1930. Mexican family goes insane. Texas newspaper, 1927. These weren't news stories. They were propaganda. But the readers didn't know that. The readers saw headlines, saw scary stories about loco weed and killer weed and reefer madness, and they believed it, because it confirmed what they already feared. Because it gave them permission to hate people they already wanted to hate. The cannabis was the excuse. The racism was the point. By 1930, the stage was set. State-level prohibition had spread across the country. Public perception had shifted from useful plant to foreign menace. The medical establishment was largely ignoring cannabis in favor of newer synthetic drugs, and American culture was marinating in racialized panic about Mexicans and black people. All that was needed now was a villain, someone to weaponize all this fear into federal policy, someone ambitious, ruthless, and desperate enough to build an empire on lies. And in 1930, that man arrived. His name was Harry Jacob Anslinger, and he would become the most successful drug warrior in American history. Harry Anslinger had a problem. It was 1930, and the stock market had just crashed. The country was spiraling into the Great Depression. Banks were failing, Businesses were collapsing. The government was slashing budgets everywhere. And Anslinger had just been appointed the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a new agency carved out of the Treasury Department, tasked with enforcing the nation's drug laws. Except America's drug laws barely existed. Alcohol prohibition was still technically the law of the land, but everyone knew it was doomed. The country was exhausted from 13 years of bootleggers, speakeasies, and gang violence. Repeal was coming, which meant Anslinger's agency, before it even truly existed, was about to lose its primary mission. He needed a new enemy. He needed a crusade. He needed something that would justify his budget, expand his power, and secure his position. He needed cannabis. Anslinger was a career bureaucrat, born in Pennsylvania, 1892, worked his way up through the Treasury Department, helped enforce alcohol prohibition in the Bahamas, where he witnessed, and by some accounts participated in, brutal enforcement tactics. He learned early, fear works, violence works, public hysteria works. He was also ambitious, calculating, willing to say whatever needed to be said to advance his career. And he was connected. His wife's uncle was Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury and one of the richest men in America. Mellon controlled the DuPont chemical empire. DuPont was developing synthetic fibers, nylon, rayon, that would compete directly with natural hemp. Whether that connection mattered is debated. What's not debated? Anslinger needed an enemy, and cannabis was available. But here's the problem. Anslinger faced in 1930. Nobody cared about cannabis. Seriously. The American Medical Association wasn't concerned about it. The general public barely knew it existed outside of southwest border towns and urban jazz clubs. 16 states had banned it, sure, but that was local politics, not a national panic. So Anslinger had to create the panic. He had to transform a plant that most Americans had never heard of into a threat so terrifying that Congress would give him unlimited power to destroy it. And he succeeded. Brilliantly, horrifyingly. First, he rebranded it. The medical term was cannabis. The industrial term was hemp. Both words sounded neutral, scientific, non-threatening. So Anslinger used the Mexican-Spanish term marijuana. Say it out loud. Marijuana, foreign, exotic. Vaguely threatening. A word that sounds like it came from somewhere else, from people who aren't like us. This was deliberate. This was strategic. Use a Spanish word to emphasize the Mexicanness of the drug. Make it sound alien. Make white Americans associate it with immigrants, with foreigners, with the other. It worked. Second, he built what he called the Gore Files. A filing cabinet in his office, stuffed with newspaper clippings about crimes allegedly connected to marijuana. Most of the stories were sensationalized. Many were misleading. Some were completely fabricated. Didn't matter. Anslinger collected them all. And whenever he needed to prove marijuana was dangerous, he'd pull out a story from the Gore Files and present it as evidence. One of his favorites, Victor Licata. In 1933, in Tampa, Florida, a 21-year-old man named Victor Licata murdered his parents, 2 brothers, and sister with an axe. Gruesome, horrifying, national news. Anslinger immediately claimed Licata was a marijuana addict, said marijuana drove him to madness, to violence, to murder. Used the case in congressional testimony, in speeches, in propaganda materials. But there was a problem. Victor Licata had severe, documented mental illness. He'd been in and out of psychiatric care for years. There was no evidence he'd ever used marijuana. None. The local police never mentioned it. The doctors treating him never mentioned it. The connection existed only in Anslinger's imagination. But by the time the truth came out, decades later, the damage was done. The story had been repeated so many times, it became fact. Anslinger understood something crucial. A lie repeated loudly and frequently becomes truth. Third, he launched a media campaign. Anslinger fed stories to newspapers. He worked with Hollywood to produce propaganda films. He gave speeches warning that marijuana was turning American youth into violent criminals. The most famous result, Reefer Madness, 1936. If you've seen it, you know it's absurd, laughably over the top. Kids smoke marijuana at a party and immediately descend into madness. One commits murder, one commits manslaughter, one dies, one goes insane. It's ridiculous. But in 1936, it wasn't a joke. It was propaganda designed to terrify parents, and it worked. Anslinger's message was simple, repetitive, and racist. Marijuana makes Mexicans violent. Marijuana makes black men rape white women. Marijuana destroys the minds of white children. Marijuana must be stopped. Now, before I show you the most damning quote in American drug policy history, hit subscribe on 12 AM Historian. You need to see this documented. In 1934, Anslinger wrote to his agents. His actual words, preserved in documents now available through the Library of Congress. There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the US, and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz and swing, result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. Read that again. This isn't a rumor. This isn't hearsay. This is the first Commissioner of Federal Narcotics, in writing, saying the quiet part loud. He wasn't concerned about public health. He was concerned about race mixing, about white women sleeping with black men, about Mexicans and Filipinos existing in public spaces. Marijuana was the tool. White supremacy was the goal. And it worked. In 1937, Anslinger went before Congress to advocate for the Marijuana Tax Act. This law wouldn't technically ban marijuana. That might be unconstitutional. Instead, it would impose such extreme taxes and regulations that possession would be effectively criminal. Anslinger testified for hours. He presented his gore files. He told stories of marijuana-induced violence. He claimed marijuana was more dangerous than heroin, more addictive than cocaine, more destructive than any drug known to man. Congress asked, "What does the medical community think?" The American Medical Association sent Dr. William Woodward to testify. He opposed the bill. He told Congress that cannabis had legitimate medical uses, that there was no scientific evidence it caused violence, that the proposed law would make medical research impossible. Congress ignored him. Anslinger's propaganda had done its job. The public believed marijuana was a menace. Congressmen believed it. The press believed it. The Marijuana Tax Act passed. And just like that, a plant that had been used for 10,000 years became a federal crime. But here's the truly diabolical part. The law was designed to be a trap. To legally possess marijuana, you needed to pay a tax and get a stamp. But to get the stamp, you had to bring marijuana to a government office, which meant admitting you possessed it, which was already illegal under most state laws. It was a catch-22, designed not to regulate marijuana, but to criminalize anyone who touched it. Doctors couldn't prescribe it. Pharmacists couldn't sell it. Researchers couldn't study it. The medical establishment that had used cannabis for centuries was suddenly locked out. And for the people Anslinger really wanted to target, Mexicans, Black Americans, jazz musicians, immigrants, the law gave police unlimited power to arrest them, search them, deport them. All you needed was the smell of marijuana, or the claim that you smelled it, or the suspicion that maybe, possibly, someone in the vicinity might have smoked it. The plant was the excuse. The people were the target. And Harry Anslinger had just built the machine that would destroy millions of lives. But this was just the beginning. Anslinger would run the Federal Bureau of Narcotics for 32 years, longer than J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI. 3 decades of propaganda, enforcement, and expanding power. And in those 3 decades, he would successfully export American prohibition to the world. He would pressure international bodies to ban cannabis globally. He would turn a plant into a crime against humanity. But even Anslinger, at the peak of his power, couldn't have imagined what would come next. Because in the 1960s and 70s, a new generation would discover marijuana. And the next architect of American nightmares would use Anslinger's playbook to build something even more monstrous. Before I show you how deep this rabbit hole goes, tell 12 AM historian in the comments, how many people do you think were arrested for marijuana between 1937 and today? Write your guess, because I promise you, the real number will shock you. The machinery was built. Now it needed bodies to feed it, and feed it they did. By 1960, Harry Anslinger was still in power, still commissioner, still feeding the propaganda machine, still testifying to Congress that marijuana caused insanity, violence, death. But American culture was shifting beneath his feet. The children born after World War II, the baby boomers, were coming of age, and they were different. They questioned authority. They protested war. They listened to rock and roll. They grew their hair long. They rejected the conformity their parents had embraced. And some of them, many of them, started smoking marijuana. Not because Harry Anslinger told them it was dangerous, because Harry Anslinger told them it was dangerous. When you tell teenagers that marijuana will make them insane, and then they try it and simply feel relaxed and giggly, they start wondering, what else did you lie about? Vietnam? Segregation? The entire social order? Marijuana became countercultural, not because of its effects, but because of who opposed it. If the establishment hated it, it must be worth trying. By the mid-1960s, marijuana use was exploding on college campuses. White, middle-class kids, the children of doctors and lawyers and congressmen, were smoking the same plant that had been used to criminalize Mexicans and Black Americans for decades. And suddenly, the establishment had a problem. In 1962, Anslinger finally retired, but his propaganda had done its work. The infrastructure of prohibition was locked in place. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics had expanded. Treaties had been signed. International prohibition was now law in most of the world. All that was needed was someone willing to weaponize it further. Enter Richard Nixon. 1968. America is burning. Cities erupting in riots after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. Protests against the Vietnam War shutting down campuses, the counterculture movement spreading, young people openly defying traditional authority. Richard Nixon runs for president on a platform of law and order. He promises to restore peace, to crack down on crime, to end the chaos. He wins. And immediately he faces a problem. How do you criminalize political dissent without technically criminalizing political dissent? You can't arrest someone for opposing the war. That's protected speech. You can't arrest someone for being black. That's unconstitutional. But you can arrest them for drugs. In 1971, Nixon declares a war on drugs. He calls drug abuse public enemy number one. He demands harsher sentences, more enforcement, more prisons. He frames it as a public health crisis, a moral crusade to save American children. But that's not what it was. In 1994, 23 years after Nixon launched the war on drugs, a journalist named Dan Baum interviewed John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief. Ehrlichman had been imprisoned for his role in Watergate. He had nothing left to lose, and he told the truth. Baum published the interview in 2016 after Ehrlichman's death. Here are Ehrlichman's exact words. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Let me repeat that last part. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. This is not conspiracy theory. This is not speculation. This is a top Nixon administration official admitting, in documented testimony, that the war on drugs was designed to criminalize political enemies. If you're feeling anger building, that means you're paying attention. Subscribe to 12 AM Historian and comment how many people you think this policy destroyed. I promise you, the number will break your heart. The machinery Nixon built was elegant in its brutality. In 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act. This law created a schedule system for drugs based on their potential for abuse and medical value. Schedule, say, high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use, unsafe even under medical supervision. Schedule, high potential for abuse, accepted medical use. Schedule. 3. IV. V. Decreasing levels of concern. Marijuana was placed in Schedule 1, the same category as heroin, above cocaine, above methamphetamine, above fentanyl. The government's official position. Marijuana has no medical value and is one of the most dangerous substances known to man. This was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. The American Medical Association opposed it. Researchers protested. Even Nixon's own appointed commission, the Schaefer Commission, studied marijuana for 2 years and recommended decriminalization. Nixon ignored them, ignored his own commission, ignored science, ignored medicine, because this was never about public health. Here's the beautiful cruelty of Schedule I designation. It made marijuana impossible to study. See, to research a Schedule I drug, you need special DEA approval, you need extensive documentation, you need funding, and even if you get all that, you can only use marijuana provided by the federal government, which grows one strain of poor quality, specifically for research. And if your research suggests marijuana might be beneficial, good luck getting it published. Good luck getting your next grant approved. Schedule. I created a perfect circular logic. We can't remove marijuana from Schedule because there's no research showing medical benefit. There's no research showing medical benefit because marijuana is Schedule I. The cage was locked from the inside. But the real genius of Nixon's war on drugs wasn't the scheduling system. It was mandatory minimum sentences. In 1973, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, frustrated by rising crime rates, pushed through the Rockefeller drug laws. These laws mandated 15 years to life for possession of 4 ounces of marijuana or any amount of harder drugs. 15 years to life for possession, not dealing, not trafficking. Simple possession could destroy your entire existence. Other states watched and copied. By the 1980s, mandatory minimums were spreading like cancer across American law. Federal guidelines followed. Judges lost discretion. Prosecutors gained overwhelming power. The threat became plead guilty to a lesser charge or risk going to trial and getting the mandatory minimum 10 years, 20 years, life. Most people pleaded guilty, even if they were innocent, even if it was their first offense, even if it was a tiny amount. Because 20 years in prison versus 2 years probation isn't a choice, it's coercion. Then came Ronald Reagan. If Nixon built the machine, Reagan gave it unlimited fuel. In 1982, Reagan escalated the war on drugs into a full military operation. He increased federal drug fighting budgets from $1.5 billion to $6.6 billion. He expanded asset forfeiture laws, meaning police could seize cash, cars, homes from anyone suspected of drug activity without even charging them with a crime. Suddenly, local police departments had a financial incentive to make drug arrests. Seize someone's car, and your department gets to keep it. Raid someone's house, confiscate $10,000 cash, and that's $10,000 for new equipment. Marijuana arrests became profit centers. In 1986, Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. This law created the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Crack, associated with black communities, carried sentences 100 times harsher than powder cocaine, associated with white communities. But the law also dramatically increased marijuana penalties. Enhanced sentences for cultivation, for distribution, for possession with intent. The federal government allocated $1.7 billion specifically for new prison construction. They were preparing for a wave of bodies, and the bodies came. In 1980, fewer than 42,000 Americans were incarcerated for drug offenses. By 1990, 247,000. By 2000, 450,000. By 2010, over 500,000. In 30 years, the incarcerated drug offense population grew by more than 1,100%, and marijuana arrests led the way. Between 1965 and 2020, over 26 million Americans were arrested for marijuana-related offenses. 26 million. That's more than the entire population of Australia. It's more than the populations of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden combined. It's more people than live in all of Central America. The vast majority, approximately 88%, were arrested for simple possession. Not dealing, not trafficking, not violence, possession. Having a plant in your pocket. One arrest every 58 seconds at the peak in 2010. That's one life potentially derailed every single minute. But here's where it gets even darker. The arrests weren't random. They weren't evenly distributed. They weren't colorblind. Study after study, survey after survey, research project after research project, all show the same thing. White Americans and black Americans use marijuana at roughly the same rates. Sometimes black usage rates are slightly lower, sometimes slightly higher. But the differences are statistically insignificant, within margin of error. And yet, black Americans are 3.73 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. In some states, the disparity is even worse. In Montana, 8.2 times more likely. In Kentucky, 9.4 times more likely. In Iowa, 7.3 times more likely. Let me make this crystal clear. If you're black in America, you are nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession despite using it at the same rate as white Americans. This is not accidental. This is not a bug in the system. This is the system working exactly as designed. The war on drugs gave law enforcement the tools and the justification for aggressive policing of black and brown communities. Stop and frisk policies in New York City, broken windows policing in Los Angeles, traffic stops in Ferguson, Missouri. The pattern was everywhere, all the time, relentless. Police would stop someone, often for the flimsiest reason, a broken taillight. Suspicious behavior, walking in the wrong neighborhood. They'd search the person, the car, the bag, find a joint, arrest, find a few grams, arrest, find paraphernalia, arrest. And with that arrest came a cascade of consequences that could destroy a life. This is still happening, right now. Subscribe to 12 AM Historian because this story doesn't have an ending yet. Here's what one marijuana arrest could mean. Immediate consequences, jail time, even for first offense. Bail you can't afford, so you sit in jail awaiting trial. Lose your job because you can't show up. Legal fees you can't pay. So you get a public defender who's overwhelmed pressure to plead guilty to avoid harsher sentence long-term consequences. Criminal record that shows up on every job application. Ineligible for federal student loans, ineligible for public housing, ineligible for food stamps, difficulty getting professional licenses. Immigration consequences, green card holders deported. In many states, lose your right to vote. Cascading consequences, can't get a job, can't pay rent, become homeless, can't access housing assistance. Family breaks apart. Child Protective Services. Investigates, children removed from home. Probation violations, missed appointment, failed drug test. Back to jail. Spiral continues across years, across decades. A single joint could unravel an entire existence, and it did. Millions of times. The human cost is almost incomprehensible. But let me try to make it real. Think of a young man. Let's call him Marcus. He's 19, living in Baltimore. He's got a high school diploma, working part-time at a grocery store, taking community college classes. He wants to be an electrician. One night, he's walking home from a friend's house. There's a joint in his pocket. Not his. His friend gave it to him. He was going to smoke it later. Whatever. It's there. Police stop him. Routine, stop. They search him. Find the joint. He's arrested. Can't afford bail. Sits in jail for 3 weeks waiting for trial. Loses his job. Misses his community college classes. Gets kicked out of the semester. His public defender recommends pleading guilty to avoid trial. Says if he goes to trial and loses, he could get a year. If he pleads guilty, maybe probation. He pleads guilty. Gets probation. Community service. Fines. Now he has a criminal record. He applies for jobs. Background check comes back. We've decided to go with another candidate. He applies for student loans to go back to school. Denied. Drug conviction. He applies for an apartment. Denied. Criminal record. His probation requires regular check-ins, drug tests. He misses one appointment. His car broke down. Probation violation. Back to jail for 30 days. When he gets out, he's homeless. Can't find work. Can't get housing assistance. Drug conviction makes him ineligible. 5 years later, Marcus is still trying to rebuild his life from a single joint. This story isn't hypothetical. This is the story of hundreds of thousands of young men. mostly black, mostly poor, mostly in cities that were systematically targeted by police, and it's generational. Children of incarcerated parents are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated themselves. When you arrest a father for marijuana, you don't just destroy his life. You damage his children's futures. You destabilize the family. You remove income. You create trauma. In some neighborhoods, predominantly black neighborhoods, predominantly poor neighborhoods, the incarceration rate was so high that it became normal. Everyone knew someone in prison. Everyone had a family member with a record. Communities were hollowed out. The war on drugs didn't just arrest individuals. It waged war on entire communities. And marijuana, harmless marijuana, the plant that had been medicine for thousands of years, was the weapon of choice. Because it was everywhere. Because it was easy to find. Because possession was easy to prove. It was the low-hanging fruit for a system designed to feed bodies into cages. By 2010, America had 2.3 million people in prison, up from 300,000 in 1980, the largest incarcerated population in the world, more than China, more than Russia, more than any nation in human history. 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prisoners. And at the peak, more than half of federal prisoners were incarcerated for drug offenses. Marijuana arrests accounted for more than half of all drug arrests. The machine that Anslinger built, that Nixon weaponized, that Reagan turbocharged, it was working exactly as intended. It wasn't reducing drug use. Studies showed usage rates barely changed. It wasn't making communities safer. Crime rates rose and fell independent of incarceration rates. It was doing what it was designed to do: control populations, suppress dissent, and generate profit. Because by the 1990s, a new industry had emerged: private prisons, corporations that made money by filling beds, that signed contracts with states guaranteeing 90% occupancy, that lobbied for harsher drug laws to ensure a steady supply of prisoners. The Corrections Corporation of America, the GEO Group, multi-billion-dollar industries built on human cages, and marijuana arrests kept the system fed. But here's the final, unbearable irony. The same government that was arresting millions for marijuana was also profiting from it. In 1999, the US government was awarded patent number 6EX3 507, cannabinoids as antioxidants and neuroprotectants. The patent covers the use of non-psychoactive cannabinoids to treat neurological diseases. The government literally owns a patent acknowledging the medical value of cannabis compounds, while maintaining that marijuana has no medical value and keeping it Schedule I. While people sit in prison for possessing it, while children are taken from parents for using it, while lives are destroyed for touching it. The hypocrisy isn't hidden. It's documented. It's official. It's shameless. This is the machine. This is what it looks like when power decides that control matters more than truth, more than justice, more than human life. And this machine kept running, kept grinding, kept destroying, until finally, impossibly, people started fighting back. The first crack in the machine didn't come from politicians or scientists. It came from the dying. 1980s, San Francisco. The AIDS epidemic is ravaging the gay community. Young men are dying by the thousands, wasting away, losing weight so rapidly their bodies consume themselves. The medical establishment is failing them. The government is ignoring them. Ronald Reagan won't even say the word AIDS publicly until 1987, 6 years after the first cases. But someone notices something. gay men with AIDS who smoke marijuana don't lose as much weight. Their nausea improves. They can eat. They have appetite. They survive longer. It's not a cure, but it helps. It works. And if you're dying, if doctors have given up on you, if the government has abandoned you, you don't care if something is Schedule I. You care if it keeps you alive. A man named Dennis Peron becomes one of the central figures in this story. Peron was a gay activist in San Francisco. His partner, Jonathan West, died of AIDS in 1990. Before he died, marijuana helped him maintain his weight, keep his strength, retain some quality of life. Peron decided if marijuana could help his partner, it could help others. In 1991, he opened the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club, an underground dispensary, technically illegal, openly operating. He served AIDS patients, cancer patients, anyone suffering, anyone dying, anyone the medical establishment had failed. The San Francisco police knew about it. They raided it occasionally for show. But the community protected it, because everyone knew someone who was dying. Everyone saw that it worked. By 1995, the Cannabis Buyers Club had over 8,000 members, and Dennis Peron had proven something crucial. Marijuana had medical value. Undeniable, documented, witnessed by thousands, medical value. The federal government's position that marijuana had no medical use was a lie, and the dying had exposed it. In 1996, California voted on Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act. This ballot initiative would legalize medical marijuana in California. Patients with doctor recommendations could possess and use it. Caregivers could grow it for them. The federal government opposed it. The DEA opposed it. Law enforcement opposed it. The pharmaceutical industry opposed it. But California voters passed it, 56% to 44%. For the first time since 1937, a state legalized marijuana. The dam had cracked. The federal government responded immediately. Bill Clinton's drug czar, General Barry McCaffrey, announced that doctors who recommended marijuana would lose their DEA licenses, would be excluded from Medicare and Medicaid, would be prosecuted. The message was clear: defy federal prohibition and we will destroy your career. But doctors sued, and in 2002 the Ninth Circuit Court ruled that doctors had a First Amendment right to discuss marijuana with patients. The federal government backed down. Meanwhile, the DEA began raiding California dispensaries. Federal agents with guns, storming medical marijuana facilities, arresting caregivers, confiscating plants. The images were devastating. Federal agents arresting wheelchair-bound patients, raiding hospices, shutting down facilities serving the dying. Public opinion began to shift. Other states were watching. If California could legalize medical marijuana, why couldn't they? 1998, Alaska, Oregon, Washington legalized medical marijuana. 1999, Maine. 2000, Colorado, Nevada, Hawaii. The dominoes were falling. By 2010, 15 states had medical marijuana laws. By 2020, 38 states. Each victory was hard fought. Each state faced federal opposition, law enforcement resistance, pharmaceutical industry lobbying. But patients kept testifying. Mothers whose children had intractable seizures, veterans with PTSD, cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy. The evidence was overwhelming. The stories were undeniable. Marijuana worked, and the Schedule I designation was exposed as a political decision, not a medical one. The science was piling up too. Because as more states legalized medical use, researchers finally had access to patients, to data, to evidence. They discovered that cannabis reduced seizures in children with epilepsy, sometimes dramatically, from hundreds of seizures per week to nearly none. One case became famous. Charlotte Figge, a Colorado girl with Dravet syndrome. She suffered 300 seizures per week. Her parents tried every medication. Nothing worked. Doctors said there was nothing more they could do. In desperation, her parents tried cannabis oil, specifically CBD, the non-psychoactive compound. Charlotte's seizures dropped to 2 or 3 per month. Her story went viral. It changed the national conversation. Because how do you maintain that marijuana has no medical value when a child stops seizing? How do you keep it? Schedule a line when parents are saving their children's lives with it. The answer, you can't. Not without revealing that the scheduling system was always a lie. But the most important shift was happening quietly, in public opinion. In 1990, only 16% of Americans supported marijuana legalization. By 2000, 31%. By 2010, 44%. By 2013, majority support for the first time. By 2020, 68%. What changed? Information. The internet made it impossible to control the narrative. People could research for themselves. They could see the evidence. They could compare marijuana's actual effects to the government's propaganda. They learned that marijuana had never caused a fatal overdose. Not one. Not in recorded history. They learned that alcohol kills 95,000 Americans per year. Tobacco kills 480,000. Opioids kill 70,000. Marijuana kills 0. They learned that marijuana is less addictive than alcohol, tobacco, or caffeine. They learned that the dangers they'd been taught, reefer madness, insanity, violence, were fabrications. Every lie Anslinger told, every propaganda film, every scare tactic, exposed, documented, ridiculed. And people realized, if they lied about this, what else did they lie about? Before I show you how these people risked everything, subscribe to 12 AM Historian and comment. Name someone who fought back that we should remember, because these heroes deserve recognition. The activists who fought back were extraordinary. There was Jack Herer, author of The Emperor Wears No Clothes, a book that meticulously documented hemp's industrial uses and marijuana's medical benefits. He spent decades advocating, educating, refusing to be silenced. There was Rick Steves, the travel writer and TV personality, who used his platform to advocate for legalization, arguing that the war on drugs was a humanitarian disaster. There was Dr. Lester Grinspoon, a Harvard psychiatrist who started researching marijuana to prove it was dangerous, and ended up becoming one of its strongest advocates after discovering the evidence showed the opposite. There were thousands of patients willing to testify publicly, to reveal their medical conditions, to risk arrest to tell the truth. There were lawyers who worked pro bono defending dispensaries, growers, patients. There were entrepreneurs who opened dispensaries knowing they could be raided at any moment. Each one took enormous personal risk: federal prosecution, asset forfeiture, social stigma, career destruction. But they did it anyway, because the lies had gone on long enough. And then came the breakthrough. November 6th, 2012, Colorado and Washington state vote on full recreational legalization, not medical, not limited, not with restrictions. Full legalization. Adults could possess, use, and purchase marijuana. The federal government said it was impossible. That states couldn't legalize something the federal government prohibited, that the Controlled Substances Act preempted state law. Colorado and Washington did it anyway. Both measures passed. Colorado, 55%, yes. Washington, 56%, yes. The federal government faced a choice: raid every dispensary, arrest every grower, fight a war against two entire states, or back down. In 2013, the Obama administration announced a policy shift. The DOJ wouldn't challenge state marijuana laws as long as states maintained strict regulations. It wasn't full surrender. Federal prohibition remained. But it was an acknowledgement of reality. The war on marijuana had lost public support. The floodgates opened. 2014, Alaska, Oregon. Washington, D.C. legalize. 2016, California, Maine, Massachusetts, Nevada. 2018, Michigan. 2020, Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, South Dakota. 2021, New York, Virginia, New Mexico, Connecticut. By 2024, 24 states had legalized recreational marijuana. 38 states had medical programs. The change happened so fast, it gave cultural whiplash. In 1 decade, marijuana went from a federal crime that could destroy your life to a legal product sold in stores, advertised on billboards, taxed by governments. States that legalized saw billions in tax revenue. Colorado alone collected over $1 billion in marijuana taxes in its first 8 years. Jobs were created, regulations established, safety standards implemented, and the sky didn't fall. Crime didn't explode. Children weren't endangered. Society didn't collapse. All the fears, all the propaganda, all the warnings, none of it came true. The war on marijuana had been based on lies from the beginning, and now, finally, the truth was winning. But here's where the story gets complicated, because legalization isn't justice. The legal marijuana industry in 2024 is worth approximately $30 billion annually. It's projected to grow to $57 billion by 2030. Who owns this industry? Overwhelmingly, white men. According to industry data, over 81% of cannabis business owners are white. Less than 2% are black. Let me repeat that. Black Americans were nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana. Black communities were devastated by the war on drugs. And now that marijuana is legal and profitable, black Americans own less than 2% of the industry. How is this possible? The barriers to entry are enormous. In most states, a cannabis business license costs anywhere from $50,000 to $500,000. Then you need real estate, and most landlords won't rent to cannabis businesses. You need lawyers, compliance officers, security systems. You're looking at $1 to $5 million in startup costs. And if you have a drug conviction on your record, in many states, you're automatically disqualified from getting a license. Think about that. The people who were arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned for marijuana, often for tiny amounts, often as first-time offenders, are now legally barred from participating in the industry. While wealthy investors, often white, often with no prior connection to cannabis, can waltz in with capital and capture the market, the communities that suffered the most are excluded from the profits. It gets worse. Many of the companies now dominating the legal marijuana industry are connected to people who supported prohibition. Former DEA agents now work as consultants for cannabis companies. Former politicians who voted for harsh drug laws now sit on cannabis corporate boards. John Boehner, former Republican Speaker of the House, who once said he was unalterably opposed to legalization. He joined the board of Acreage Holdings, a major cannabis corporation. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. The same people who built the machine, who fed it bodies, who profited from prohibition, are now profiting from legalization. And the people who suffered? Still locked out. This should enrage you. It enrages me. Tell 12 AM historian in the comments, how do we fix this? Some states tried to address this. Illinois created a social equity program. giving licensing preference to applicants from communities disproportionately affected by the war on drugs. Massachusetts set aside licenses for economic empowerment applicants. California created equity programs in multiple cities. These programs helped, but they were often underfunded, poorly implemented, or deliberately sabotaged. In Illinois, the social equity program was immediately challenged in court. Licenses were delayed for years. By the time equity applicants got their licenses, the market was already dominated by well-funded corporations. In California, many equity licensees couldn't afford the compliance costs, the real estate, the legal fees. They sold their licenses to larger companies or went out of business. The system was designed to fail them. And here's the cruelest part. People are still in prison. As of 2023, over 40,000 Americans are incarcerated for marijuana-related offenses. Let me say that again. 40,000 people are currently in prison for marijuana, while corporations make billions selling the same plant. Some of those prisoners are serving life sentences for marijuana, while dispensaries operate legally down the street from their prisons. This is obscene. Some states have moved to expunge marijuana convictions, to clear records, to release prisoners. California passed legislation allowing people with marijuana convictions to have their records expunged. Over 200,000 people eligible. But expungement isn't automatic. You have to apply. You have to navigate a complex legal process. Many people don't know they're eligible. Many can't afford a lawyer to help them, and expungement doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't give you back the years in prison. It doesn't restore the job you lost. It doesn't repair the family that broke apart. It doesn't erase the trauma. It just means the record is sealed. The scars remain. Meanwhile, federal prohibition continues. Marijuana remains Schedule Y, the same classification as heroin. Federal employees can be fired for using marijuana, even in legal states, even off-duty. Immigrants, even legal permanent residents, can be denied citizenship or deported for marijuana use. Banks won't work with cannabis businesses because marijuana is federally illegal, so dispensaries operate in cash, making them targets for robbery. Research remains restricted. Scientists still can't study marijuana freely. Veterans can't access medical marijuana through the VA, even though many suffer from PTSD and chronic pain. The federal government maintains the fiction that marijuana is dangerous and has no medical value, while states prove the opposite every single day. And internationally, the damage continues. The United States pressured dozens of countries to adopt prohibition. Many did, destroying traditional uses, criminalizing cultures, filling prisons. In Mexico, the war on drugs fueled cartel violence that has killed hundreds of thousands. American demand for drugs, American prohibition policies, American weapons, all contributing to a humanitarian catastrophe. In the Philippines, the war on drugs led to extrajudicial killings. Thousands executed without trial. In Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, American prohibition exported as policy has caused immeasurable harm. And even as America slowly legalizes, these countries continue prohibition, continue enforcement, continue the violence. The American drug war wasn't just domestic policy. It was cultural imperialism, and its consequences span the globe. There's also the corporate sanitization of history. Walk into a modern dispensary. It's clean, professional, corporate. The products have sleek packaging, the staff wear uniforms, everything designed to look legitimate, safe, medical. Which is fine. Except, the marketing often erases history. Cannabis is presented as a new discovery, a modern wellness product, an innovation. The thousands of years of traditional use, forgotten. The indigenous knowledge, ignored. The communities that kept cannabis culture alive during prohibition, often at great personal risk, written out of the story. The black and brown people who were arrested, imprisoned, destroyed, not mentioned. The industry wants the profits without the context, wants legitimacy without acknowledging the injustice, its revisionist history in real time. But perhaps the most bitter pill, the new inequalities legalization creates. In legal states, wealthy neighborhoods get dispensaries with beautiful storefronts, high-quality products, educated staff. Poor neighborhoods, often the same neighborhoods that were targeted by the war on drugs, get nothing. Or they get lower quality options. Or they get pushed out entirely by gentrification driven by cannabis businesses. The people who suffered the most often benefit the least. Meanwhile, suburban white consumers, who were rarely arrested, rarely imprisoned, rarely had their families torn apart, now enjoy legal access without any of the trauma. They can walk into a dispensary, buy marijuana, and go home. No criminal record, no fear of arrest, no generational trauma. The privilege is stunning. So where does that leave us? Marijuana is legal in half the country. Medical programs exist in most states. Public opinion overwhelmingly supports legalization. This is progress. Undeniable progress. No more teenagers having their lives destroyed for possession. No more DEA raids on hospices. No more federal agents arresting dying AIDS patients. The lies have been exposed. The propaganda has failed. The truth that marijuana is relatively harmless, medically beneficial, and far less dangerous than legal substances like alcohol and tobacco has won. But this victory is incomplete. People remain in prison. Communities remain scarred. The industry remains white-dominated. Federal prohibition continues. International harm persists. History is being sanitized. And the architects of the war on drugs, most faced no consequences. Anslinger died respected. Nixon resigned in disgrace over Watergate, not the drug war. Reagan is lionized. The DEA agents who raided dispensaries kept their pensions. No one has been held accountable. No reparations have been paid. No official apology has been issued. The government that destroyed millions of lives has never admitted wrongdoing. This is the bittersweet reality of progress. Things improve, but justice is never fully served. The plant still grows. In legal dispensaries, in suburban gardens, in prison yards where people serve sentences for it. The plant doesn't know about the laws, the propaganda, the hypocrisy, the suffering. It just grows, waiting for humans to catch up to what we should have known all along. That it was never about the plant. It was always about control, about power, about who gets freedom and who gets cages. And until we face that truth, until we free the prisoners, compensate the communities, dismantle the structures of oppression, the victory remains incomplete. The war may be ending, but peace has not yet arrived. The plant grows in a federal research facility in Mississippi. One farm, one strain, controlled by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the only legal source of marijuana for research in the United States. For decades, this was the bottleneck. If you wanted to study marijuana, you had to use their product, and their product was deliberately poor quality, low potency, contaminated with mold and stems, nothing like what patients actually used. Scientists complained for years. They said it was like trying to study wine by examining grape juice. The government didn't care. But in 2021, something changed. The DEA announced it would finally allow additional facilities to grow marijuana for research. Break the monopoly. Allow scientists access to real, high-quality cannabis. That was 3 years ago. As of 2024, not a single new facility has been approved. The applications sit. The bureaucracy stalls. The research remains blocked. This is what obstruction looks like when you can no longer ban something outright. You don't say no, you just never say yes. Meanwhile, in states where marijuana is legal, research is flourishing. Universities in Colorado, California, Washington are studying cannabis effects on PTSD, chronic pain, epilepsy, anxiety, inflammation, cancer. The results keep coming in. And they keep confirming what traditional medicine knew thousands of years ago. Cannabis works. It reduces seizures in children with epilepsy, sometimes eliminating them entirely. It helps veterans with PTSD manage symptoms without the side effects of pharmaceutical drugs. It reduces opioid use in chronic pain patients. Study after study shows that states with medical marijuana have lower opioid overdose rates. It helps cancer patients maintain appetite during chemotherapy. It reduces inflammation in conditions like Crohn's disease and arthritis. None of this is speculation. This is peer-reviewed, published, replicated research. And yet, marijuana remains Schedule I. No accepted medical use. The lie persists in federal law even as reality demolishes it. In 2022, President Biden announced he would pardon all federal simple marijuana possession offenses. Sounds good, right? Except, no one is in federal prison for simple possession. Federal prosecutions target trafficking, cultivation, distribution. Simple possession is handled at the state level. So Biden's pardon freed exactly 0 people from federal prison. It was a symbolic gesture that changed nothing. He also asked the Department of Health and Human Services to review marijuana's scheduling. To consider rescheduling it from Schedule, you need to Schedule 3, the same category as Tylenol with codeine. That review is ongoing. As of 2024, marijuana remains Schedule Y. The wheels of government turn slowly when they want to. And apparently, they want to. Let me show you what ongoing prohibition still means. In Texas, possession of any amount of marijuana is a criminal offense, 2 ounces or less. Up to 180 days in jail, $2,000 fine. 4 ounces, up to a year in jail, $4,000 fine. People are still being arrested, still being prosecuted, still being imprisoned. In 2022, Texas arrested over 40,000 people for marijuana possession. 40,000. While California, next door, has legal dispensaries on every corner. In Idaho, marijuana possession remains a misdemeanor for first offense, felony for subsequent offenses. No medical program, no decriminalization, full prohibition. In South Dakota, voters passed a recreational marijuana ballot initiative in 2020. The governor sued to overturn it. The state Supreme Court sided with the governor. The will of the voters was nullified. They tried again in 2022, passed it again. This time, it stuck. But the fight, the resistance from the establishment, reveals how desperately some cling to prohibition. At the federal level, Border Patrol can still search and arrest for marijuana. DEA can still raid grow operations on federal land. Federal employees can still be fired for legal use. The patchwork is chaos. You can legally buy marijuana in Colorado, drive to Wyoming, and be arrested for possession. Same plant, same amount. 30 minutes apart, one legal, one criminal. This is the reality of progress without federal reform. And the racial disparities still stark. Even in states that have legalized, Black Americans are still arrested at higher rates. In Washington, D.C., where marijuana is legal, Black residents are still arrested for public consumption at 11 times the rate of white residents. In New York City, before legalization, 94% of marijuana arrests were of Black or Latino people. After legalization, enforcement of illegal cannabis activity still disproportionately targets the same communities. Because legalization didn't erase the power structures, it didn't retrain the police, it didn't undo generations of targeting. The laws changed, the enforcement patterns remained. Tell 12 AM historian in the comments. What question haunts you most about this story? Because these questions demand answers. Here are the questions that keep me awake. Question 1. When will the last prisoner be freed? 40,000 people still imprisoned for marijuana, some serving life sentences, some eligible for parole, but denied because of the nature of the crime. In Missouri, Jeff Mizanski served 21 years of a life sentence without parole for marijuana-related offenses. Not violence, not murder. Marijuana. He was released in 2015 after a public campaign, but only after 2 decades stolen from his life. How many Jeff Mizanskis are still in prison? How many will die there? And when they're finally released, because eventually they will be, who compensates them for the stolen years? Question 2. Who will be held accountable? Harry Anslinger died in 1975, respected and honored. Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace over Watergate, not the drug war. Ronald Reagan is remembered as a conservative icon, not as the architect of mass incarceration. John Ehrlichman admitted the war on drugs was designed to criminalize political enemies. He faced no consequences for that admission. He was already in prison for Watergate. The drug war revelation changed nothing. The DEA agents who raided dispensaries, who arrested dying patients, who destroyed lives, they retired with pensions. The politicians who voted for mandatory minimums, who expanded prohibition, who ignored evidence, many are still in office. Some now profit from the legal industry. The pharmaceutical companies that lobbied for prohibition, that fought medical marijuana, that profited from opioids, they now develop cannabis-based drugs. Who faces justice for 80 years of systematic oppression? The answer appears to be no one. Question 3. How do we repair the damage? You can expunge a record, you can release a prisoner, but you can't undo the trauma. How do you compensate a man who lost 20 years to prison? How do you repair a community that was systematically targeted for decades? How do you restore trust in institutions that deliberately lied? How do you heal generational trauma caused by mass incarceration? Some cities are trying. Oakland, Los Angeles, San Francisco have reparations programs. Cannabis tax revenue going to communities harmed by the drug war. But the amounts are tiny compared to the damage. A few $1 million against decades of destruction. It's a gesture, a symbol, not sufficient, not remotely sufficient. Question 4. Why do we trust them now? The government lied about marijuana for 80 years, deliberately, systematically, knowingly. They fabricated evidence, they ignored science, they suppressed research, they demonized patients, they imprisoned millions. And now, some of those same institutions are regulating the legal marijuana industry, setting standards, collecting taxes, claiming expertise. Why should we believe them? What makes this time different? What prevents them from lying again about the next substance, the next community, the next target? The machinery still exists. The DEA still has power. The prison industrial complex still profits from incarceration. The incentives that created the war on drugs haven't been dismantled. So what stops them from doing it again? Question 5. What about the rest of the world? The United States forced global prohibition through treaties, through aid conditions, through diplomatic pressure. Now that America is slowly legalizing, what happens to the countries that adopted prohibition because America demanded it? Jamaica, where cannabis is part of Rastafarian religious practice, criminalized it under pressure from the US. They've since decriminalized, but decades of enforcement destroyed lives. Mexico, where cartel violence fueled by drug trafficking has killed hundreds of thousands, continues prohibition while America legalizes. The Philippines, where Rodrigo Duterte's drug war led to thousands of extrajudicial killings, continues enforcement. Does America have a moral obligation to these countries? To acknowledge the harm its policies caused? To provide resources for reform? Or will America simply legalize domestically and abandon the international mess it created? Question 6. What about the plant's future? Corporate consolidation is already happening. Big companies buying smaller ones, Wall Street investors entering the market, patents being filed on cannabis strains, extraction methods, delivery systems. The plant that grew wild for 10,000 years is being privatized, commodified, monopolized. Indigenous communities that preserved cannabis knowledge during prohibition, often at great risk, are being pushed out by corporations that patent traditional practices. The genetics that took centuries to develop are being bought, owned, controlled. What happens when a handful of corporations control the entire cannabis supply? What happens when strains are patented and traditional growers are sued? What happens when profit, not medicine, drives cultivation? This is already happening, and no one is stopping it. Question 7. Are we learning anything? Right now, America is facing another drug crisis: opioids, prescription painkillers, then heroin, now fentanyl. Over 100,000 overdose deaths per year. The government's response? Increased enforcement, harsher sentences, crackdowns on users, the same failed war on drugs playbook. Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001, treated addiction as a health issue, not a criminal one. Overdose deaths dropped, HIV infections dropped, drug use rates dropped. The evidence is clear. Criminalization doesn't work. Treatment works. But America can't seem to learn the lesson. We watched 80 years of marijuana prohibition fail. We saw the damage it caused. We finally, slowly, reluctantly, admitted it was wrong. And then we immediately applied the same approach to the opioid crisis. How many more people have to die before we learn? These questions don't have easy answers. Some don't have answers at all. But they need to be asked, repeatedly, loudly, until someone in power is forced to respond. Because silence is complicity. Forgetting is complicity. Moving on without justice is complicity. The plant still grows. In dispensaries with clean floors and professional staff, in suburban gardens where middle-class white people cultivate it legally, in prison yards where people serve time for touching it, in Mississippi at the Federal Research Farm, controlled and restricted, in the hills of Afghanistan, the fields of Morocco, the mountains of Colombia, places where it's been grown for centuries, now criminalized, in sidewalk cracks in cities, wild and untended, oblivious to human law. The plant doesn't carry the weight of propaganda, the burden of history, the stain of injustice. It simply grows, waiting, always waiting, for humans to evolve past the need to control, criminalize, and cage each other. For humans to remember what we knew 10,000 years ago, that this plant is medicine, is fiber, is food, is sacrament, that it was never the enemy. We were. Let me take you back one more time, back to that Scythian burial chamber, back to the frozen warrior surrounded by cannabis flowers, back to the smoke rising from the brazier. For 10,000 years, humans have chosen this plant, through ice ages and empires, through religions and revolutions, through prohibition and propaganda. Every attempt to erase it only drove it deeper into human consciousness. Every lie told about it was eventually exposed. Every prison built to punish its use eventually crumbled. Because you cannot criminalize human nature. You cannot imprison a truth that keeps growing. The war on marijuana was never about public health. It was never about protecting children. It was never about science or medicine or safety. It was about control, about using law to target specific populations, Mexicans, Black Americans, hippies, anti-war protesters, anyone who threatened the established order. It was about power, about bureaucrats building empires, about politicians winning elections, about corporations eliminating competition, about prisons filling beds. It was about profit, about police departments seizing assets, about private prisons signing contracts, about pharmaceutical companies protecting market share, about the entire machinery of the carceral state feeding itself. And it was about fear, about a society so terrified of freedom, of consciousness expansion, of people thinking differently, that it was willing to destroy millions of lives to maintain control. The plant was the excuse. The cruelty was the point. But here's what they didn't anticipate. Truth is persistent. Science doesn't care about propaganda. Evidence doesn't care about political narratives. Reality doesn't bend to bureaucratic classification, and humans, stubborn, curious, rebellious humans, don't stop seeking what helps them, what heals them, what connects them to something larger. So despite 80 years of lies, despite millions arrested, despite careers destroyed and families shattered and communities decimated, the truth survived. Cannabis has medical value, undeniable, documented, proven. Cannabis is relatively safe, far safer than alcohol, tobacco, or many legal pharmaceuticals. Cannabis prohibition was racist from the beginning, explicitly, documentedly, intentionally racist. The war on marijuana was a policy failure of historic proportions. It achieved none of its stated goals and caused immeasurable harm. These are facts now, not opinions, not beliefs, facts. And once facts emerge from lies, they can't be put back. So where do we go from here? The optimistic view, we're at a turning point. Federal legalization is inevitable. Just a matter of time. Within a decade, marijuana will be legal nationwide. Records will be expunged. Prisoners will be released. The drug war will become a cautionary tale we teach in history classes. The pessimistic view, the damage is done. Millions of lives were destroyed. Communities were shattered. Trust was broken. And the systems that created this nightmare, policing, incarceration, political corruption, corporate capture, remain intact, ready to target the next vulnerable population. The realistic view. Both are true. Progress is real. But justice is incomplete. Change is happening, but slowly, unevenly, reluctantly. And the question isn't whether marijuana will eventually be fully legal. The question is, will we learn anything from this horror? Because this pattern, criminalize a substance, target a population, build an enforcement apparatus, ignore evidence, maintain control through fear. This pattern is not unique to marijuana. It happened with alcohol during prohibition. It's happening now with opioids, with psychedelics, with other substances. It happens when power decides that control matters more than human welfare. And it will keep happening until we fundamentally change how we think about drugs, about criminalization, about who deserves freedom and who deserves cages. The plant doesn't care about our laws. It grew before we existed. It will grow after we're gone. It doesn't judge us for the propaganda we believed, or the prisons we built, or the lies we told. It simply offers what it has always offered: medicine for pain, fiber for rope, seeds for food, flowers for consciousness. The same gifts it offered to those Scythian warriors 2,500 years ago, the same gifts it offers today, unchanged, unbothered, patient. But we carry all of it. The weight of 26 million arrests, the burden of 40,000 still imprisoned, the knowledge that our government deliberately, systematically, knowingly destroyed lives for political gain, the awareness that this horror happened in our lifetimes, in our names, with our tax dollars. We carry the responsibility of what comes next. So here's what we owe. We owe the truth. No sanitization, no corporate revisionism, no pretending it wasn't as bad as it was. The full, documented, unflinching truth about what was done and why. We owe the prisoners. Release them immediately, not eventually, now. Every single person incarcerated for marijuana should walk free today, not tomorrow, today. We owe the communities reparations, real ones, not symbolic gestures. Billions of dollars in cannabis tax revenue should go to the communities that were targeted for education, housing, healthcare, economic development, for healing. We owe the families. Acknowledgement that the drug war didn't just harm individuals. It destroyed families, removed parents, traumatized children. Compensation can't undo that damage, but it can help repair it. We owe accountability. Someone needs to face consequences. If the architects are dead, then their institutions must acknowledge wrongdoing. Official apologies. Government admissions of error. Names removed from buildings, legacies reassessed. We owe structural change, dismantle the DEA or fundamentally reform it. End private prisons, eliminate mandatory minimums, treat addiction as healthcare, not criminal justice. Stop criminalizing consciousness. We owe it to ourselves, to look honestly at what our society is capable of, to recognize that mass incarceration, systemic racism, state-sanctioned cruelty, these aren't aberrations, they're features. And until we face that, we'll keep repeating the pattern. The story of marijuana is ultimately a story about human freedom, about what happens when power decides certain people deserve freedom and others don't, about who gets to alter their consciousness and who goes to prison for it, about who profits and who suffers, about who writes history and who gets erased from it. For 10,000 years, humans and cannabis coexisted, sometimes sacred, sometimes medical, sometimes recreational, sometimes industrial, but coexisting, peacefully, naturally. Then, for 80 years, a handful of men with power decided that coexistence was dangerous. They declared war on a plant, and in doing so, they declared war on millions of people. They lost. Not completely. Not yet. But inevitably. Because you cannot permanently suppress truth. You cannot indefinitely imprison freedom. You cannot forever control consciousness. The ancient Scythians knew this. When they placed cannabis in burial chambers, they were acknowledging something profound. This plant connects us to something beyond the material world, beyond law and power and control. They didn't fear that connection. They honored it. Modern society feared it. And in that fear, we built prisons, destroyed lives, and inflicted suffering on a scale those ancient warriors could never have imagined. But the plant outlasted the fear. It outlasted the propaganda. It outlasted Harry Anslinger and Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and the DEA and the prison industrial complex and 80 years of systematic oppression. It's still here, still growing, still offering its gifts, patiently waiting for us to catch up to what humans knew 10,000 years ago. So I'll ask you one final time. Was marijuana ever really the world's most dangerous drug? Or was it the most dangerous truth? The truth that consciousness can be altered without permission. That healing can happen outside pharmaceutical control. That people can find connection, relief, spirituality, joy, without authorization from power. That a plant, simple, natural, ancient, could expose the emptiness of the propaganda, the cruelty of the law, the violence of the state. That's what they feared. Not the plant, the freedom it represented, and if ancient civilizations understood this thousands of years ago, if they used it as medicine, as sacrament, as tool, as companion, if they honored it, studied it, integrated it into their lives without fear, what exactly did they know that modern society spent 80 years and trillions of dollars trying to make us forget? Maybe they knew that some truths can't be criminalized, some freedoms can't be imprisoned, some plants can't be killed, and some questions, once asked, can never be unasked. This story isn't over. It won't be over until the last prisoner is freed. Until communities are compensated, until the systems that enabled this nightmare are dismantled, until we face what was done in our name, until we promise and mean it, that this will never happen again. Subscribe to 12 AM Historian. Share this with everyone who needs to know. Comment with the question that haunts you most, because these questions demand answers. And stay awake, because the next chapter of this story, the final reckoning, the actual justice, it depends entirely on whether we're paying attention, on whether we remember, on whether we care enough to demand that truth. Finally, fully, wins. The plant will keep growing regardless. The question is, what will we do?